The measure of intelligence is the ability to change. Hi all, Dr. Clark here, and we're going to continue talking chemistry. We're going to continue talking about basically the chemistry of water, but we're going to switch directions a little bit and start talking about ions and pH. And now a lot of you probably, a lot of this will be review, that maybe you got this when you're in high school, maybe you got this even in middle school or in another college class, but we're going to address this because ions are extremely important for energy, and pH is important for the functionality of our bodies, but also the functionality of a lot of other organisms and biochemical pathways, etc. So let's talk a little bit about pH real quick, from the standpoint of food and things like that. A lot of you have probably had this experience. Okay, this is showing acid reflux, or what is often the cause of heartburn, where the sphincter muscle here doesn't close and you get acid release back up into the esophagus, and it starts irritating and burning kind of the tissue in the esophagus. That's what causes that pain, that you feel in your chest, and is often associated with heartburn. And sometimes, if it's severe enough, can be misdiagnosed or basically self-diagnosed as a heart attack. So there obviously is a difference, but we'll talk about buffers, and we'll talk about how to reduce the effects of this. One way to reduce the effects of this is by eating material that is not acidic, not going to increase the number of free hydrogen ions in your stomach as it's being broken down. So in other words, if you're consuming a large amount of things like, not on this list is things like soda, wine, beer, tomatoes, large amounts of meat. Most meats are acidic once you break them down. Beef, pork, chicken, salmon, it's all acidic once you start breaking it down. Oh, there's beer on the list. Okay, rice wine down there. But a lot of acidic foods will cause acidosis. Now, acidosis is different than, acid reflux. Acidosis is a change in blood chemistry, the blood pH. And this can be is much more severe than something like acid reflux. Okay, but the same things that can cause acidosis can cause acid reflux. So one way that you can limit or minimize the amount of acid reflux or the effects or possibility of acidosis is by eating things that are balancing each other out. So if you're going to eat a bunch of chicken, eat it with some type of lettuce or spinach, or carrots. So if you eat things that are balanced pH-wise, it'll balance that material in your gut, your stomach, while it's being dissolved. Okay, so the pH range of our blood is from 7.35 to 7.40. That is healthy. If you become more acidic, so the pH actually goes down, you go into acidosis. If it increases, you become more alkaline, you lose hydrogen ions, or you have less hydrogen ions. Okay? It's another problem, a health issue. Okay? Majority of the time, we're experiencing this acidosis and not the reverse, but sometimes it is the reverse. Okay? But, just for point of reference, normal pH of our blood is 7.35 to 7.40. Okay? A neutral pH, okay, which our blood is not, a neutral pH, okay, there's quite a few things that are neutral, like water. Okay? Water is a pH of 7, and we'll come back and look at why water, pure water, is a pH of 7. All right, let's dive into what ions are, or what ionization is. Okay, so I talked about before that water is extremely important. Water forms via covalent bonds. Water has the capability of forming hydrogen bonds, but water itself can sometimes break down spontaneously. So the covalent bond, even though the covalent bond in water is a strong bond, sometimes it breaks spontaneously. When it breaks down, it forms this: a hydroxide ion and a hydrogen ion. And you can see there, they're going to have charges associated with them. Hydroxide ions are negatively charged. Okay, so they contain an electron, which gives them that negative charge. Hydrogen ions are going to be positively charged, so it's no electron associated with it, just the proton is associated with it. Okay, so this hydroxide ion, well, I shouldn't say no electron, okay, but less electrons are associated with them. Okay. Hydroxide ions are going to have that negative charge. Again, that charge is coming from that oxygen, pulling electrons away from this molecule, and the molecule is now broken into separate pieces. This is where our pH scale comes in. Okay? This spontaneous breaking is what we call ion formation or ionization. Right? It's not super common, but it's common enough that we have an entire scale that's based on this. This is where pH comes from, that separation of hydrogen ions, right, and hydroxide ions, and the difference in a solution of the number of hydrogen ions to hydroxide ions is where we get our pH scale. Right, so again, it's not super common for spontaneous breaking of covalent bonds, but it happens enough that we have a scale, and also that scale also is associated with normal bodily functions of consuming material, having enzymes break it down into their smallest parts, and having some hydrogen ions being released or some hydroxide ions being released. So pH, again, this is how we express how many hydrogen ions are in solution. Okay, so how many hydrogen ions, so H positive, how many hydrogen ions are in solution is what the pH scale is based on. Now, because you can have a tremendous amount of hydrogen ions in solution, our pH scale is logarithmic. Okay, so it's a logarithmic scale. So the difference between a pH of 1 and a pH of 2 is the pH of 1 has 10 times more hydrogen ions than a pH of 2. Okay, so again, the pH scale is logarithmic. It's log base 10. Okay, so the difference of 1 unit represents a 10-fold change in hydrogen concentration. Okay? You go up in numbers, you have less hydrogen ions. You go down in number on the pH scale, you have more hydrogen ions. We'll look at this in more detail, okay, by looking at this scale. All right, so if you have a pH of 0, it means you have an extremely high number of hydrogen ions compared to hydroxide ions. And in fact, if you have a pH of 0, you have no detectable hydroxide ions. It's just hydrogen ions. And that would be something like hydrochloric acid. The opposite is true. If you take and you go all the way to the other end of the scale, to a pH of 14, okay, you have no hydrogen ions and only hydroxide ions. So something like sodium hydroxide is the most basic you can get, okay, where the hydrogen ions are not present. Pure water, okay, is going to have an equal number of hydrogen ions to hydroxide ions. Some things that a lot of people like to consume: cola, beer, vinegar, tomatoes, coffee. Okay, they're all acidic, meaning they all have more hydrogen ions than they do hydroxide ions. Some of you might know that if you have something like heartburn or acid reflux, or you have an upset stomach due to drinking or eating a lot of material on this side of the spectrum, you know that you can take things on the other side of the spectrum to balance it out. Okay? Like baking soda, or like calcium carbonate, or milk of magnesia. Okay, there's lots of things that are based on this side of the spectrum to basically pick up the free hydrogen ions on this side of the spectrum from consuming material, too much material over here. And we'll look at that. That's called buffering. And we'll look at examples of that and how those examples work, or how that material works. Okay, so there you can see baking soda, milk of magnesia. Those things are going to often be taken to combat things like beer, pizza, okay, which is tomato juice or tomato sauce based, and meats and cheeses are over here also. So if you drink a lot of beer, drink a lot of cola, eat a lot of pizza, okay, you're loading yourself up with high concentrations of hydrogen ions. You may be taking some baking soda or milk of magnesia. Calcium carbonate is in here too. That's what Tums and kind of Rolaids are made of. They're going to be sitting here. That'll balance out that material. Okay, so just to recap, pure water has a pH of 7. Okay? That means there's an equal amount of hydrogen ions to hydroxide ions. Okay? Acids, any substance that has more hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions. Okay, so acids run from 0 to 6.9. Bases are anything with less hydrogen ions than hydroxide ions. So they're running from 7.1 to 14. Right. So often you'll want to make sure that you're reading questions correctly. When the question asks you, is this substance, does this substance have a higher pH or lower pH? Right? If that is what is being talked about, like the actual pH number, A higher pH is going to be a base. A lower pH is going to be an acid. Okay? But if it's asking you, does this substance have higher number of ions, hydrogen ions, then the lower the number, the lower the pH value, the more hydrogen ions you're going to have. So you need to be careful with what the wording of questions are, okay? Because, the process is pretty simple. The scale is pretty simple. You just got to know that acids have a higher number of hydrogen ions than bases. And as you go down in pH number, you increase the number of hydrogen ions tenfold with each step. All right, so most living cells, most living organisms, most environments are fairly close to 7. All right, that doesn't mean they're 7, like our blood is not 7, but it's close to 7. It's close to neutral. Okay? And the reason for that is, well, water's close to neutral, or water is neutral. Pure water is neutral. Now, the water that you consume is often not, well, it's not even often. It is not pure water. Okay? The water you consume is water with other, trace elements that are in it. Okay? And so trace amounts of sodium, trace amounts of other material that's in it, okay? Which can make the pH not be exactly 7. So just keep that in mind. That's why on the scale it says pure water. Pure water means there's nothing else in it. There's no sodium in it. There's no, trace metals in it. Nothing in it. It's just water molecules. Okay, so back to this. When we start looking at proteins, when we start looking at biochemical pathways, way your body works, most of it works around that 7. Most of your proteins have that kind of pH range or tolerance around 7. That being said, though, your pH range of the molecules in your stomach is not 7. Right? So proteins have a sensitivity range. Right? And so the proteins that are in your stomach, like the proteins that are breaking down sugars and fats and proteins and other things that you're digesting, their pH range is not 7. Their pH range is close to 2 for us, okay? Because stomach acid is a pH of 2, okay? And so their pH range is going to be somewhere in that range of 2. So just keep that in mind. Proteins that are going to be working in your blood and your muscles and in those regions, they're going to be close to 7. But proteins that occur in, say, your digestive juices inside your stomach or even inside your intestines, where it still might be fairly acidic, they're going to have a pH range somewhere closer to 2. It's not going to be 7. So acids, bases, again, other organisms are going to have other ranges than we will. Maybe they have more acidic, maybe their blood is more acidic than us. So instead of that range of 7.3 to 7.4, maybe their range is 7.5 to 7.8 or 7.8 to even 8. So the range that other organisms encounter are different. Okay, even for that matter, the range that they other organisms occur in their environment might be different. And so that you need to take that into account when we talk about pH. Not all organisms are going to be sitting at neutral, but most organisms, because of water being neutral, they will have proteins in that neutral range. Now, organisms use buffers. Okay, buffers are a way to minimize the pH disturbance, either the pH disturbance from consuming material, dietary disturbance, the pH disturbance from breaking down material. Okay, so the process of cellular respiration, breaking it down, the process of photosynthesis, okay, the process of taking in carbon dioxide can make the tissues of plants become acidic. So they are going to use buffers to minimize the pH disturbance. Buffers are really any chemical substance that has the ability to take up or release hydrogen ions. Right, so if you have too many hydrogen ions in solution, you can use a buffer that will bind up those free hydrogen ions, right, and it will change the pH back to what the pH was, or as close to what it was as possible, depending on the buffer. You might have a situation where you have too little hydrogen ions, so too many hydroxide ions. Okay? So you're too basic. So you might take a substance that releases hydrogen ions, so you can push it back the opposite direction. Now, I just want to make sure that you understand that buffers are not removing acids, and they're not removing bases, right? But they're minimizing the effects of hydrogen ions or hydroxide ions. Okay? So it's not, if you pop a bunch of Tums, if you take, a whole container of Tums, you're not changing your stomach acid from a pH of 2 to a pH of 5. Okay? You're not changing the acid. Now, if there's free hydrogen ions from your diet, from the material you consumed, it will bind those hydrogen ions up, okay, and allow for those hydrogen ions to not affect the stomach lining, to not, affect the reactivity inside your stomach. Okay? But it's not changing or removing the acid in your stomach. And often when we talk about biochemical pathways, or when we talk about photosynthesis, or we're talking about these other kind of processes that are either converting energy from one source to another, there are natural buffers. Okay? And often they're paired substances. So you might have an acid that is paired up with a base. Okay? And when when the acid gets out of whack, the base increases and pushes that acid-base equilibrium back to as close to equal as possible. Okay, or as close to normal as possible. Okay, it's homeostasis. Okay, so with that, again, hydrogen ions are determining the pH. Now that ion concentration, especially hydrogen ions, hydrogen ions are associated with energy. So you're going to see that hydrogen ion come back. It's going to come back when we start talking about energy changing forms, going from a chemical energy or a potential energy to a kinetic energy, or going from a kinetic energy back to a potential energy. Changing forms, going from products of photosynthesis to the ability of an organism to consume those products of photosynthesis through the process of cellular respiration. Okay, so when we come back, we're going to talk about energy, okay? And energy from a biological standpoint. Next time.